This morning, I'd like to begin by talking about sheep and shepherding sheep. As someone that grew up in a big city, I absolutely know nothing about sheep or shepherding. So if today's gospel uses that analogy, then I think for most of us with no experience of sheep or shepherding, this will be good context. Here's what we know about sheep. And for those of you who know a few things about sheep, I'll ask you at the end to share. Also, as I throw out these facts, I invite you to consider how similar or dissimilar these sheep are to humans. Here's what we know. There's currently over 1 billion sheep on Earth today. There are over 1,000 different breeds of sheep, and they can range in weight from 100 to 350 pounds. Each sheep has a distinct personality. Collectively, they are a prey species, and their only defense is to flee. Sheep are intensely sociable and bond closely with other sheep. This enables them to have a flock mentality, which protects individuals from predators. Sheep can visibly express emotions: fear, anger, boredom, sadness, and even happiness. When they experience stress or isolation, they can even show signs of depression by hanging their heads and avoiding positive actions. It's even been proven that they can express optimism or pessimism. Not surprisingly then, sheep can not only distinguish between different faces, but they can distinguish different expressions. This proves that sheep are not stupid. Rather, they have a high degree of emotional intelligence and an amazing memory. Moreover, they can be playful and puppy-like. They can show affection and communicate their needs. And sheep, interestingly, can self-medicate. They do this by eating specific plants that will help cure them. So humans have been domesticating sheep for at least 10,000 years. We've been using their wool, drinking their milk, and eating their meat for that long. In order for us to reap the benefits of sheep, shepherds protect them from predators and other dangers. And shepherds lead them to green pastures. What's more, shepherds more often than not assist sheep with giving birth. So, more often than not, sheep need humans to give birth. As you might know, shepherding is the first profession mentioned in the Bible. Among the titles given to ancient kings were shepherd of the people. King David himself not only received this title, but was himself a shepherd. Not surprisingly then, one of the most popular images of God in the Old Testament is shepherd. This is exemplified and reinforced by Psalm 23 that begins, "The Lord is my shepherd." This is perhaps the most popular psalm. In the New Testament, as you may recall, shepherds were among the first to greet the baby Jesus on Christmas. And in today's gospel, we hear of Jesus as the Good Shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep and leads us to abundant life. That's all I've been able to find about sheep and shepherding. Does anyone with experience with sheep want to share what they know about sheep? So I taught the Bible at the U of A for about 7 years, and every time we got to the Psalms, I touched on this because it was the most popular Psalm, 23. And I'd ask every class that I had in 7 years if any students raised sheep. And out of the hundreds of students, one young woman put her hand up and she said, "They're cuddly, they're very affectionate, you want to bring them inside the house, you might even want to cuddle with them. But they also smell really bad." And so a shepherd working with them will also pick up that smell. And so Jesus is not afraid, the Good Shepherd, to get dirty with us, to smell like us, to be one with us, as we proclaimed in the profession of faith. Also, as we've considered these sheep facts, I hope you've come to see some commonalities between humans and sheep. For me, it's that they're very intelligent, that they have a great memory. They can tell what's dangerous, what plants are dangerous, and that they're also emotionally aware. so they can read others' expressions, not only the shepherd's, but other sheep's expressions. And so they're vulnerable and therefore interdependent. Now, comparing sheep with humans isn't to degrade humans. I understand that we can insult someone by saying they're a sheep. This implies that they're stupid or just a blind follower. On the contrary, to say that we are similar to sheep, I think is a compliment. After all, they are highly intelligent, emotionally aware. They are social and interdependent, and yet individually unique. And fundamentally, they are naturally vulnerable, fearful, and yet have the ability to survive and thrive with each other and with a shepherd. Another side point, I think that sometimes we humans forget that we're also animals, biological beings interconnected with each other and the earth. When we forget that, we tend to treat nature, water, resources, and animals like objects for dominion rather than siblings we must care for. When we forget that, we trust in our own power rather than a higher power. Okay, enough about sheep. Let's go back to the gospel. If there's one thing I'd like you to walk away with today, besides a deeper knowledge of sheep, although maybe a deeper knowledge of sheep will remind us of this, it's that we all have fears, but we can be secure in God who is the Good Shepherd. We all have fears that we don't have enough, but we can trust in God's abundance. Really, trusting in God is the fundamental thesis of every good sermon. After all, trusting in God's grace is the primary message of Christianity. Trust. Have faith in God. Be not afraid. One Bible scholar notes that the phrase, "be not afraid," is found 365 times in the Bible. It's a mantra worth repeating over and over again, considering our fearful instincts. Today's gospel begins with a warning. It says that there are predators, thieves, and bandits who will threaten us, steal us, and take us away from our safety. It's true. There are external realities that we all face that threaten our safety and security. They could actually be criminals, enemies, if we have any, economic forces like inflation, the threat of war, a giant asteroid that could crash into the planet, or even microscopic viruses like COVID-19. We humans have real external challenges that we face. We also have internal challenges like our obsession with perfection, our need to control, our need to always count the cost, and of course, fear. Notice, though, that the setting of this gospel is a sheepfold. This is to say that we find ourselves in the default context of safety. We find ourselves in the default setting of abundance. Yes, it's true, threats come to us, but the default is safety. Now, some brain scientists, psychologists, and evolutionary biologists note that humans tend to live and operate based on two poles. We live and operate between two ends of a spectrum. On one end, there are those of us who prefer stability, tradition, order, and predictability. For many of us growing up, we face challenges that caused us to cope through stability, order, and predictability. That's important, it's good. On the other end, there are those of us who prefer creativity, dynamism, and are okay with provisionality and unknowns. For many of you, growing up was a safe place for you that enabled you to stretch beyond your fears. We live between the two. We're not always one, we're not always the other. As it turns out, these two ends of the spectrum of being human have been to our advantage since the beginning. We need stable conservatives to protect us from unknowns, and we need boundary-pushing progressives in order for humans to go beyond in times of abundance. Our diverse approaches enable us to face a diversity of situations, survive, and thrive. We saw all this in our behaviors at the beginning of the pandemic. Remember the panic shopping? People clearing the shelves of toilet paper? So many of us intensified our survival instincts in different ways. So many of us coped in so many ways: knitting, planting house plants, taking up other hobbies, buying a pet. Some people turned to psychologists to assist them, and some relationships even fell apart. In common, I think, was our minimizing the voice of the Good Shepherd, forgetting that we were in the abundant sheepfold. It didn't help that our supports, church and worship, were taken away or modified. All the things that a Sunday service does for us in reinforcing our trust for God and safety in God were no longer there. We had to turn to other things. We needed to cope and survive. It's part of our instincts, after all. And through it all, we still found safety and security, some better ways than others, some ways more constructive than others. Some Bible scholars note how confusing the analogies in this gospel are. At the beginning, the Lamb of God, and then gate and shepherd. I wonder if this mixing of analogies is like the diverse ways we might find safety in God. God as a shepherd who guides us, God as gate who protects us from threats, God as lamb who shows us to abundant life. During the pandemic lockdown, I stayed in San Francisco and I went for long walks in my neighborhood, and I took pictures of every flower I could see, and later researched about the flowers, but also was reminded that each of these flowers were like those who died from the virus. I took up yoga again and did it from home to help me deal with stresses. I reconnected with family members through Zoom that I hadn't in a long time, and I attended worship all around North America by Zoom. God's grace and the safety it provided me came to me in so many different ways. I needed to remember that while there were thieves and bandits in the form of the insecurities and uncertainties caused by the lockdown, that I was also in the safety of the sheepfold, with Jesus, the Good Shepherd, to protect me. Jesus, the gate, who guards me from my enemies. Perhaps you too found comfort and safety in God through so many wonderful and beautiful constructive ways. Another way of looking at all this is through the lens of the theology of abundance and scarcity. Has anyone heard of that phrase before? Okay, we'll go through that then. So, trusting in God and letting go of our fears means we trust in the abundance of the sheepfold. Theologians call that a theology of abundance, that there is enough for all, that we don't need to fear not having enough. When we proclaim in our motto, "Our Lamb has conquered," we are proclaiming that Jesus offers us abundance. When we proclaim in our motto, "Let us follow him," we are committing to follow the Good Shepherd into that abundance. Contrary to the theology of abundance is what theologians call the myth of scarcity. The myth of scarcity tells the powerful to take, to dominate, to accumulate. The myth of scarcity is driven by the fear of not enough and never enough. When we live by this myth, we make our decisions out of fear and anxiety that there isn't enough for us. This has led to violence and war, inequality, hunger, and injustice. We must keep others down so that we can stay on top. We must stockpile money and food and comforts and vaccines at the expense of others. We even see this myth of scarcity in the Bible. The prophets boldly criticize the kings who ruled under the myth of scarcity and amassed wealth and power on the backs of the poor and oppressed. Today's gospel reminds us that despite external threats, we live in abundance through Christ. And yet, we'd prefer to live out the myth of scarcity, which tells us to work until we drop. Exhaustion and burnout are hallmarks of scarcity. In contrast, when we trust in God's abundance, we experience wholeness, joy, fulfillment, and rest. In fact, according to biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, the practice of living in God's abundance is an act of resistance. We are saying no to the culture of now. Now, I realize all of this is a tough truth to accept and live by. How many days now has it been with government workers on strike? There's talk now of provincial and municipal workers going on strike, and even private sector workers walking off the job for better pay to deal with the pain of inflation. We all feel it. The gospel never said that there wouldn't be external challenges. Together, we must work to overcome them. I believe Jesus is holding a picket sign with the workers right now, because Jesus, the Good Shepherd, lays down his life for his sheep. And at heart, we must remember that ultimately, trusting in God's abundance is what truly fulfills us. I've ministered to poor folks who've reminded me of that. And I've ministered to wealthy folks who struggle to accept that, and everyone in between. This is why once again, today, we reaffirmed and professed our faith. Easter reminds us that Jesus is the Lamb who shows us how to live abundantly. Jesus trusts in his Father instead of the devil. He uplifts instead of tears down. He feeds instead of hoards. He heals instead of kills. He lives compassion instead of indifference. He conquers by laying down his life instead of fighting to survive. He is risen instead of being left in the tomb. So, come, let us follow the conquering Lamb into abundance. Let us hear the voice of the Good Shepherd who knows us by name and encourages us not to be afraid. Come, let us follow him.